The neighborhood in Plano, Texas, looked like it had been cut from a glossy real estate brochure. Wide lawns stretched evenly across each property. 2-story brick houses lined up in neat rows, and SUVs gleamed in the driveways. To anyone passing through, it might have seemed like a picture of stability and quiet success. For Dena, however, it felt like a cage lined with flowers. Her husband, Robert, had built a career in corporate finance. He was steady, predictable, and, though she would never admit it aloud, dull. Their marriage had started with passion, but the years had smoothed it into something polite and routine. Robert's evenings were spent hunched over a laptop or dozing in front of ESPN, while Dena drifted from room to room, searching for something that might remind her she was alive. That summer, she found herself attending more neighborhood gatherings than usual. It wasn't that she enjoyed the shallow conversations about property taxes or new school policies, but there was a certain relief in stepping outside the suffocating silence of her own home. She dressed carefully for these events, applying lipstick a shade brighter than she normally wore, telling herself it was just to feel presentable. At the annual block barbecue, held in the Wilsons' backyard, Dena met him. Eric, the newcomer. He was in his early 30s, a freelance photographer who had moved from New Orleans after a breakup. His hair was longer than what most suburban men wore, his clothes casual but stylish in a way that fell out of place among polos and khakis. Most striking of all were his eyes, curious, observant, as if they carried a private understanding of the world. When Robert excused himself to talk business with another husband, Dena found herself standing beside Eric near the grill. Their conversation began with small talk, the oppressive Texas heat, the smoky tang of the barbecue sauce, the way the cicadas droned in the trees. But soon, something in his voice drew her in. Unlike Robert, he asked her questions and seemed genuinely interested in her answers. It wasn't much, just laughter over a shared joke, a fleeting brush of his hand when he passed her a beer. But it unsettled her. For the first time in years, she felt noticed. She felt seen. That night, lying beside Robert in their king-size bed, she replayed the brief encounter in her mind. The sound of Eric's laugh, the way his gaze lingered for just a second too long, the spark that made her heart beat faster. She told herself it was nothing, just the harmless thrill of attention. But deep down, she knew she had stepped onto dangerous ground. The following week, Dena tried to shake off the strange restlessness that had crept into her since the barbecue. She kept herself busy, running errands, shopping at the local mall, and attending her regular yoga class. Yet no matter what she did, her thoughts circled back to Eric. His easy laugh, his curious eyes. It was as if he had left fingerprints on her mind. On Wednesday afternoon, while Robert was buried in meetings downtown, Dena stopped at the small cafe near the library. She had planned to order an iced latte and catch up on a novel she had been pretending to read for months. To her surprise, Eric was there, sitting at a corner table with his camera bag slung over the chair. He looked up as she entered, and the recognition in his expression made her pulse quicken. "Dena," he said warmly, as though they were already old friends. "Didn't expect to see you here." Her instinct was to play casual. "I come here sometimes," she replied, smiling too quickly. "It's quieter than Starbucks. Want to join me?" He gestured toward the empty chair. She hesitated, knowing how easily such small choices could snowball into something bigger. Still, she found herself sitting down. The conversation came effortlessly. He talked about his photography, weddings, portraits, the occasional freelance assignment for a travel magazine. She confessed how monotonous her days had become, though she dressed her words carefully, never mentioning the depth of her dissatisfaction. Half an hour passed in what felt like minutes. When she finally stood to leave, Eric tilted his head and said, "You should come by my place sometime. I could show you some of my work from New Orleans. You might like it." The invitation hung in the air, charged and dangerous. Dena laughed lightly, masking the way her stomach fluttered. "Maybe I will," she said, slipping her bag over her shoulder. That night, Robert returned home exhausted, muttering about quarterly reports. He barely looked at her as he reheated leftovers and disappeared into his office. Dena sat at the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll through her phone, but her mind was already elsewhere. She pictured Eric's apartment, unfamiliar, intimate, a world apart from her carefully ordered suburban home. She told herself it was harmless curiosity, no more than a neighborly visit. Yet the thought of stepping through that door filled her with both fear and anticipation. In the quiet of her bedroom, while Robert's snores rumbled faintly down the hall, Dena whispered the words to herself as if testing their weight. I might go. It took Dena nearly 2 weeks to accept Eric's invitation. Each time she thought about going, she invented excuses. Doctor's appointments, errands, chores that couldn't wait. But the pull only grew stronger. The memory of his voice lingered in her mind, and each quiet evening beside Robert made the contrast sharper. Finally, on a warm Thursday afternoon, she found herself driving across town, rehearsing lines in her head as though preparing for a performance. If anyone asked, she was going to yoga class, Robert wouldn't question it. He rarely did anymore. Eric lived in a modest apartment complex near downtown, nothing like the pristine suburban houses she was used to. The building smelled faintly of paint and coffee, and the hallway was lined with bicycles and potted plants. When he opened the door, barefoot and smiling, she felt an unfamiliar rush of adrenaline. Glad you came, he said, stepping aside to let her in. His apartment was small but vibrant, filled with photographs pinned across the walls. Street musicians, stormy coastlines, candid faces of strangers. The place radiated a kind of raw creativity, chaotic but alive. Dena ran her fingers lightly along a framed photo of a woman standing in the rain, her hair plastered to her face. She looks real, Dena whispered. That's the point, Eric said. I try to capture people when they're not pretending. The words struck her deeper than she expected. How many years had she been pretending? Pretending to be satisfied, pretending to be the perfect wife in their picture book neighborhood? They sat close on his worn leather couch, flipping through albums. At first, it was only art, only conversation. But when their knees brushed and neither pulled away, silence fell between them. Eric leaned in slowly, as though giving her time to stop him. She didn't. The kiss was soft at first, tentative. Then hunger overtook them both. Her heart pounded as his hands found her waist, pulling her closer, dissolving the last barrier she had clung to. Dena knew she had crossed an invisible line, one she could never uncross. When she finally left, the sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. She drove home with trembling hands, her lips still tingling. The guilt arrived quickly, sharp and undeniable, but so did an intoxicating sense of power. For the first time in years, she felt alive, as though she had stepped out of a dream and into something dangerous and real. That night, when Robert asked if she'd enjoyed yoga, she smiled and lied without hesitation. After that first kiss, nothing returned the way it had been. Dena found herself living in 2 separate realities. By day, she was a dutiful wife in the suburbs, attending community meetings, watering the lawn, smiling politely at Robert's co-workers when they stopped by for dinner. But in the hidden corners of her week, she was someone else entirely, restless, hungry, and reckless. She began inventing excuses with ease. Yoga classes multiplied on her schedule. Dentist appointments stretched into long afternoons. Errands at the mall lasted until evening. Robert hardly noticed. He was too wrapped up in spreadsheets and conference calls to question why his wife was suddenly busier. Her visits to Eric's apartment became ritual. Sometimes they drank wine and listened to music while he showed her photographs from his travels. Sunset over the Mississippi River, broken neon signs glowing above deserted highways, faces of strangers captured mid-laughter. Other times, words fell away, and the two of them dissolved into each other on his couch or tangled in the sheets of his narrow bed. It wasn't just passion, though the passion was overwhelming. It was the way Eric looked at her, as if she were more than Robert's wife, more than the careful mask she wore in her neighborhood. With him, she felt visible, alive in a way she hadn't realized she was starving for. But secrecy carried its own weight. She found herself rehearsing lies before speaking them, crafting stories that would cover every trace of her absence. A forgotten receipt in her purse, a smudge of lipstick on her collar. Each became a potential betrayal. One evening, after slipping back into her suburban kitchen, she caught a reflection in the glass of the microwave. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, her lips swollen from Eric's kisses. She looked younger, almost reckless. And yet, a shadow lingered behind the glow, guilt, sharp and cold. Still, when Robert asked casually, "How was yoga?" she smiled, her voice steady. "It was good." Eric became her secret world. Tucked away like a flame she sheltered from the wind. She knew it couldn't last forever. Such fires rarely did, but she couldn't stop feeding it. After that first kiss, nothing returned to the way it had been. Dena found herself living in two separate realities. By day, she was a dutiful wife in the suburbs, attending community meetings, watering the lawn, smiling politely at Robert's co-workers when they stopped by for dinner. But in the hidden corners of her week, she was someone else entirely, restless, hungry, and reckless. She began inventing excuses with ease. Yoga classes multiplied on her schedule. Dentist appointments stretched into long afternoons. Errands at the mall lasted until evening. Robert hardly noticed. He was too wrapped up in spreadsheets and conference calls to question why his wife was suddenly busier. Her visits to Eric's apartment became ritual. Sometimes they drank wine and listened to music while he showed her photographs from his travels. Sunset over the Mississippi River, broken neon signs glowing above deserted highways. Faces of strangers captured mid-laughter. Other times, words fell away, and the two of them dissolved into each other on his couch or tangled in the sheets of his narrow bed. It wasn't just passion, though the passion was overwhelming. It was the way Eric looked at her, as if she were more than Robert's wife, more than the careful mask she wore in her neighborhood. With him, she felt visible, alive in a way she hadn't realized she was starving for. But secrecy carried its own weight. She found herself rehearsing lies before speaking them, crafting stories that would cover every trace of her absence. A forgotten receipt in her purse, a smudge of lipstick on her collar. Each became a potential betrayal. One evening, after slipping back into her suburban kitchen, she caught a reflection in the glass of the microwave. For a moment, she barely recognized herself. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, her lips swollen from Eric's kisses. She looked younger, almost reckless. And yet, a shadow lingered behind the glow, guilt, sharp and cold. Still, when Robert asked casually, "How was yoga?" she smiled, her voice steady. "It was good." Eric became her secret world. Tucked away like a flame she sheltered from the wind. She knew it couldn't last forever. Such fires rarely did, but she couldn't stop feeding it. The weeks turned into months, and what had begun as an impulsive thrill settled into a dangerous pattern. Dena became skilled at deception, moving between her two lives with the precision of an actress. Yet every performance eventually slips, and hers began to show its cracks. One Saturday morning, while Robert scrolled through emails at the kitchen table, he looked up and asked, "You've been out a lot lately. More classes? More errands?" The question was casual, but it struck Dena's nerves like a hammer. She forced a smile, hiding the way her pulse quickened. "Yoga's been expanding, new sessions, different teachers. Keeps me from getting bored." Robert nodded, distracted, but his eyes lingered on her a second longer than usual. That second felt like a spotlight. Her carelessness grew. Once, she left her phone on the counter while showering. A message from Eric flashed across the screen. "Can't stop thinking about you." Tonight, though Robert hadn't mentioned it, she couldn't shake the paranoia that he might have seen. The lies began to exhaust her. The thrill of sneaking away to Eric's apartment was still intoxicating, but now every kiss carried the aftertaste of fear. She found herself double-checking her clothes for unfamiliar scents, scrubbing away traces of perfume, erasing messages until her hands shook. One afternoon, while lying tangled in Eric's sheets, Dena confessed her unease. "He's starting to notice. I can feel it. If Robert finds out..." Eric brushed her hair back, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Then you'll have to decide what you really want," he said softly. "You can't live in two worlds forever." The words echoed in her chest long after she left. Driving back to the tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, she saw every mailbox, every neatly trimmed lawn as a reminder of the life she was betraying. For the first time, she wondered not just if she would be caught, but what would happen when she inevitably was. That night, Robert placed his hand lightly over hers at dinner, a gesture so simple yet so unfamiliar that it startled her. For a fleeting second, guilt overwhelmed her so completely she nearly confessed everything. But instead, she pulled her hand away, reaching for her wine glass, and changed the subject. The mask was slipping, and she knew it. Yet still, the fire pulled her back to Eric, as irresistible as it was destructive. The first real sign came on a Tuesday evening. Robert came home earlier than usual, his tie loosened, his face unreadable. He placed his briefcase on the counter and asked, almost casually, "How was yoga today?" Dena froze for half a second too long. "Good," she said, forcing a smile. "Challenging class." Robert nodded, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "Funny," he said softly, "because I drove past the studio this afternoon. Didn't see your car." The words landed like a hammer. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced a laugh. "Oh, I park around the corner. It's been crowded lately." Robert didn't argue. He simply looked at her for a long, silent moment before walking into his office. The sound of the door clicking shut was louder than a slam. That night, Dena lay awake, her body tense beside him. His breathing was steady, but she sensed a shift. He no longer trusted her, and the foundation of their marriage, quiet, unexamined routine, was beginning to crumble. The next day, she tried to lose herself in Eric's arms, desperate to drown the gnawing dread. But even there, the weight followed her. When he kissed her, she felt Robert's eyes in her mind, suspicious and searching. "You're distracted," Eric murmured, pulling back. "He knows," Dena whispered. Her voice cracked. "I don't know how, but he knows." Eric sighed, leaning against the headboard. "So what now? Keep lying? Or telling the truth?" The truth. The word itself was unbearable. To speak it aloud would destroy everything. Their home, their reputation, the life they had built in the suburbs. Yet the lie was no longer safe. It was collapsing around her. That evening, Robert barely spoke during dinner. He watched her with the calm, deliberate patience of someone waiting for a confession. The silence stretched so long it felt like a noose tightening around her throat. For the first time since the affair began, Dena realized there was no way back to the life she had before. The unraveling had started, and nothing she did could stop it now. The confrontation came sooner than Dena expected. On a gray Thursday evening, Robert returned home earlier than usual once again. This time he didn't head for his office, didn't loosen his tie, didn't ask how her day had been. Instead, he placed his phone on the counter and slid it across to her. The screen displayed a photo, grainy, captured from a distance, but undeniable. Dena and Eric outside his apartment, her hand resting on his chest, his lips brushing her hair, her breath caught in her throat. "Robert." "Don't," he said sharply. His voice wasn't raised, but cut deeper than any shout could have. "Don't lie to me again." The kitchen seemed to shrink around her, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Every sound grew unbearable. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but none came. "How long?" he asked finally. She hesitated, then whispered, "Months." Robert closed his eyes, as though the confirmation still managed to wound him more than the evidence already had. When he opened them again, there was no rage, only something colder. Disappointment, finality. "I gave you everything I could," he said quietly. "Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe I wasn't enough. But you didn't even give me the truth." Tears blurred her vision. "I never meant to hurt you, but you did." His voice trembled, just once, before hardening. "And now there's nothing left to say." He left the room without another word. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway felt like the end of an era, each step severing the fragile threads that had bound them together. That night, Dena sat alone in the living room, staring at the darkened windows. The suburban street outside looked unchanged, lawns trimmed, porch lights glowing, neighbors laughing somewhere in the distance. But inside, everything had collapsed. Eric's face flashed through her mind, his warmth, his passion. But even that felt hollow now, fragile against the weight of what she had destroyed. For the first time since the affair began, Dena realized the truth she had been avoiding all along. Secrets don't stay hidden in suburbia. They linger, they spread, and eventually, they burn everything down. She whispered into the silence, not sure she was speaking to Robert, to Eric, or to herself. I've lost it all. And in that stillness, surrounded by the ruins of her carefully built life, she understood that she had.